Well, good evening. I would like to begin the evening in our customary way by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land on which tonight's lecture takes place. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 2018 Foenander lecture at the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Business and Economics. I am Prakash Singh, Head of Department of Management and Marketing. We are delighted to have you join us for the 32nd annual Foenander lecture. It's great to see some familiar faces from previous lectures, as well as some first-timers in our public lecture series. This lecture was established in 1986 in memory of Orwell D. Foenander, a former academic at the university who was one of the leading figures in industrial relations scholarship in the early 20th century. Each year, we invite a distinguished figure from government, business, the union movement, or academia to present a lecture on contemporary issues in industrial relations and human resource management. Tonight, we discuss the very topical issue of pay disclosure. Australian organisations currently have a choice about, one, how much pay information to disclose to employees, and two, the extent to which employees can discuss their pay with others in their organisation. We invite Marty Andrews, the founder of Cogent, and Mark Wells, the CEO, to talk about the pay disclosure choices they have made for their organisation, Cogent, and the consequences for a range of human resource management outcomes. It is a fascinating story, and I know you will have many questions, so please jot them down during the lecture. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the conclusion of the lecture. Marty and Mark will stay for the reception after the lecture, providing you with further opportunities to ask questions and share your experiences of pay disclosures. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Marty and Mark.
Thank you, Prakash, and for the record, I'm Mark. This is Marty. He's the tech guy. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Nation, Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay respects to their ancestors past, present and future, and hopefully a few entrepreneurs as well. I'd also say that I think Marty and I are the first people to ever do this lecture in jeans. So we're Cogent. I'll probably tell you a little bit about what we do first. It's probably not obvious to everybody here what it is we do. So we've been around about 10 years, and we work with startups and large companies here in Melbourne to build businesses, essentially businesses built on technology. As you obviously realise, digital today infuses everything we do, and there are thousands of businesses being formed across the planet every day, and a lot of those founders don't know a lot about technology, and they come to companies like Cogent to help them work out how to build those new businesses. And whilst they're building those businesses as well, they often think about the culture and practices. They often come from cultures they're often very young and come from cultures where hierarchy is less valued. So they tend to think about how they might build a business differently to the traditional methods, and that's certainly true of Cogent. Cogent's purpose, that's up there. So like many companies, we do exist to create value for shareholders, but we also exist uniquely to create value for employees at Cogent as well. And the objective of that really, and Marty's going to go into some more detail about how that came to be and the mechanisms for that. But the overall objective of that is to really improve the life quality of the shareholders and the people who work at Cogent. We do that within a framework of values. Now, lots of companies talk about being values-driven. We really are at Cogent, and Marty's going to also explain a little bit about how these values came to be. The one we're here to talk about today is transparency, and the clearest and most obvious manifestation of transparency is pay transparency, and that's something that is incredibly important to Cogent. And we define transparency in this way, and the interesting thing about that is that it does not talk about financial transparency or pay transparency at all, but it does talk about integrity. And the two things are really closely linked, as are a bunch of other values as well. So, and again, we'll get onto the relationship with those two things later as well. We're going to tell our story by telling stories. So you talked about industrial relations today. We don't know a lot about industrial relations, but we know quite a lot about people. So we're going to tell stories about people. And of course, industrial relations is really relationships between different people. So we're going to focus our presentation on describing how we manage pay and transparent pay, how we hire people, and how people leave Cogent. And we're going to tell some stories around that to kind of try and bring that to life a bit. Our first story is our origin story, which Marty's going to tell as the founder of the business.
Thanks, Mark. So, yeah, what I want to do is go right back to Cogent's roots and where we began. And the core part of that story is built on values. This is one of my, sorry if my click is working. Yes, this is one of my favourite quotes around values. Everyone knows who Walt Disney is. He was the creative founder behind Disney Corp. He's the guy behind Disneyland and all the Disney comics. His brother Roy was the CEO of the Disney Corporation, and he said this: "It's not hard to make decisions when you know what your values are." Now, little did I know how true that statement was 11 years ago when I got into the business, but it is absolutely true for how we run the business every day. When you live and breathe your values throughout the business, you fall back to them all the time in your decision making, and it makes your decision making simple. It doesn't mean that the outcomes of the decisions are simple, it just means that the decision to make is simple. So for us, the one that we're going to talk about today is we had a value of transparency. It was easy to decide to be transparent about salaries. The consequences of that were quite hard. We had to work through a whole lot of stuff, and we're going to tell you some of those stories today, but it was easy to make the decision. So values became really important to us. Now, I did a bit of a survey about a year ago. This is the top 50 companies in the ASX. You probably recognise some of those labels. You might work for one of those companies. And I can tell you that 39 of those 50 companies have public statements about their values. And when you go and dig them up, you find words like this. I'll go on one, two slides. You find words like this: respect, integrity, accountability. So 18 of those companies had integrity as a value. 17 of them had respect. But for me, those things are bullshit. And the reason is respect and integrity are part of a reasonable norm. No one wants to go to a workplace that doesn't have respect and doesn't have integrity. So how does your value tell you what you do differently in your company? The answer is it doesn't. So I think those values need to be something different. You want to have something that can manifest itself in an actionable way within your organisation, okay? Which is true for us in transparency. I've got a very touchy clicker here. It's true for us in transparency. So the way that transparency manifested itself most obviously for Cogent was in open salaries. We talked about our pay openly with all of our staff. So the story begins in 2007, where we decided to be open, but we were unstructured because we'd never gone on this journey before. We didn't know how it was going to work. So we just agreed that we would be open. So back in those days, we were called Cogent Consulting. That's me 11 years ago with the guy that I started the business with, Steve. And Steve was about a decade older than me. He was a real mentor to me. So I kind of saw him as a bit of a mentor and a guiding light in the business, and his influence comes through in this quite strongly. But basically, we were good computer programmers, IT consultants, and had built a bit of a reputation, and as a result had lots of people calling us, so we built the business off the back of that. But decided explicitly that we would create a business that was a bit of a social experiment. Let's just try being values-driven and being open. See what happens. And that's what we did. So we hired in that first year a handful of people. So we ended up about 5 or 6 people. And at the end of the year, Steve says this: let's get together as a group and we'll chat about pay rises. Let's just see what happens. So what happened is we pulled up a few chairs and we sat around a whiteboard. We wrote everyone's name up and we wrote their salaries next to it and said, hey, who deserves a pay rise? Silence, like everyone's looking down and, you know, not going on. So it was really awkward, really awkward. And eventually someone said, oh, I've got 2 kids, I'd like a pay rise. Now that's a really bad way to ask for a pay rise, by the way. That's not, that kind of doesn't fly. So at some point, Steve led a decision. He just got up and said, okay, here's my suggestion. Dan, I think you've done really well this year, you should go up a bit. And he kind of wrote some numbers up on the board. And we all just went, yeah, okay, that's fine, that's good, that's great. And because Steve had quite strong respect from the people who joined the company, we had hired people that we knew and worked with, so we had kind of a history of trust with them already. That happened to work. We got through that first salary process, but we were lucky. There's no question we were lucky as a result of that. I'm going to stop using this because it's a bit sensitive. So, thank you. So we evolved, and the next manifestation of that is to put some structure behind the way that we did salary modelling. Now, I just want to read a quote here. There was an article in The Age a couple of weeks ago called "Should Employees Keep Their Salary a Secret?" And the author said this: only the bravest of organisations adopt it because they must be confident that pay inequality doesn't exist in their business, or that, if it does, they can defend it in an objective and measurable way. And that's the key term that I want to call out here. Now, we learnt that the hard way by sitting around a whiteboard and kind of deciding on what the salaries would be, that we needed to be able to defend it in an objective and measurable way. So I had, after that time, spent a couple of years of research in trying to put together a model. I'm going to briefly explain the mechanics of how that works. I just want to call it that we got bigger over that time as well, so it wasn't just half a dozen people anymore, we were growing to kind of 20-ish plus. Here's what normally happens in a big company. There's a couple of people who are in the same role, in theory with the same job, same skills, same responsibilities, but they get paid slightly differently. And it's no accident here that Lucy gets paid a little bit less than Joe, right? Now, it's only about $600. Does that matter? I think yes. That's money that's not in Lucy's pocket and she probably deserves because her peer is doing exactly the same things. There's lots of reasons why this can happen. Joe and Lucy might have joined the organisation at different times, a couple of years apart. Maybe Lucy joined and then got some CPI increases and Joe came on a bit later. Maybe Joe negotiated a little bit harder than Lucy. Maybe they had different managers who just decided on different arbitrary numbers. There's all sorts of reasons that can happen. But there's a key underlying theme here. That's not fair. Okay? They should be getting the same. And typically that comes about in organisations where you have this kind of scenario. Now, we had an organisation that started out on programmers. So I've got developers here. You have this thing called salary banding. Junior devs, between A and B. Developers between a different range and senior developers on another range. And sometimes there's a bit of overlap. And managers just get to kind of decide within that. So what we did was, instead of having bands, we pulled them out to explicit, separate levels. And each one of those levels had a description of the skills required for that level, the responsibilities required at that level, and the impact that we expected of people on their team or their company or their customers, right? So what kind of influence radius do you have? So we put some definitions down, so it starts to become objective. So when we had all these levels, then what we did was we also drew up a salary table such that each level had an associated salary. Now the point here is that everyone at the same level gets the same salary. So you start to shift the conversation away from salary and towards what do we as a company value in people at that level? What skills do we want? What responsibilities do we want? What impact do we want from those people? And that's a really valuable conversation to have as an organisation. And for us, that works as when you're at that level, you get the assessed salary. We happen to have some fixed allowances, so everyone gets some money in order to buy a laptop and pay for their mobile phone and pay for their internet access, and that's the same across the board, no matter what level you are, and you add those two things together, and you get a total. And that's kind of how it works still today at Cogent. The model has evolved and got more complex, but that's how the thing works. Now, worth noting for us that we have people in different types of roles. So for us, for example, we have software engineers, we have designers, we have product managers. So they can have slightly different salary tables and slightly different descriptions because their roles are different. But we still do the work to try and build those models. We have a rule of thumb: when we have 3 or more people in the same type of role, we build a model out for them. So here's the outcome. The focus is on the model. It's on the skills, the responsibilities, the impact. So salary reviews become straightforward. It's no longer about, do I get an extra $5,000 or not? It's, have my skills improved? Have I taken more responsibilities over the year? Is my impact radius greater? And they become rather more objective things, and if they're true, you get the salary associated with the appropriate level. It has a side effect of reducing bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious. It's very topical to talk about the gender pay gap, for example, and that's exceedingly apparent in our industry. It gets a lot of press. So when you start to take the focus off the dollars and off the negotiation about those things, it helps because some of the bias is limited. It's not completely gone. It can still exist. We're kind of well aware of that. But you can start to focus on things, and a secondary effect is when everyone in the company can see this, we now have kind of 50 people validating that that assessed level can be correct for that person. And the nice thing for us in terms of culture is the tone for transparency is set right up front. I'll drill down on this a little bit later on, but people arrive at Cogent and immediately see that model. It's immediately transparent to them. The salaries that they will earn and that other people earn is immediately transparent, and they know from day one that we live and die by a value of transparency. Some real numbers. So everyone wants to see some real money, and we talked about transparency. So I'll just kind of expose the table to you here. So this is I updated this yesterday. So our salary table starts at level -1. That's a historical effect. It used to start at 0, and I realised I had to go back to -1 because I hired someone who didn't yet have a tertiary degree. So I added a new level below. And the top of the salary levels in the model is at 28. So there's 30 levels there, right? And you can kind of see the range between them. And they're all about $5,000 apart. So in my mind, if we are arguing about a kind of $1,000 or $2,000 pay rise isn't meaningful if you're jumping to a level that you kind of end up with this kind of meaningful jump. And everyone on the same level gets the same pay. Here's another stat for you. So at Cogent, this is the average salary that gets earned by delivery staff. So people that fit into that engineer, designer, or product manager, on average, earn 134K plus super. Okay, that's the salary part of Cogent. There's another part that's quite unusual, a bit different to the industry, which is about how we do bonuses. And we actually call it profit distribution, not bonuses. Here's a comparison. On the left, you've got most companies. On the right, you've got Cogent. There's a whole bunch of costs built in at the bottom. When the company makes some money, some of that money is put towards staff bonuses, and some of it that is put towards dividends to pay to their shareholders. But when that amount gets bigger, most companies just pay more dividends. We pay more staff bonuses as well. So we define the entire amount of money that will get distributed. Half of it goes back to staff. And everyone gets the same. It's not linked to your level or your salary. So the only thing we do is pro rata after 2 years. After you've been in the company 2 years, someone who's at level 1 on the salary model gets the same bonus as someone who's at level 28 on the salary model, because it's a team effort. Your salary is differentiating your skills and responsibilities and impact. After that's paid, we're in it as a team. Okay? So we have people who are on $60,000 salaries getting a $10,000 bonus, right? Which is highly unusual in the industry. Okay, I've been talking for a bit, so that's kind of the history and the mechanics of how stuff works. I'm going to dive back into some more stories now, so I'll let Mark pick up the pieces.
Yeah, so we're going to tell a bunch of stories now about the kind of, I guess, the full life cycle of being at Cogent. So it's joining, working, and working out, working with, and leaving Cogent as well, because people, believe it or not, do leave us. They often come back, so it's quite strange. So we're going to start on joining first. I'm going to tell actually my story about joining Cogent. I like talking about myself. So that's me. On an aeroplane. I'm actually living the dream there. I'm in Qantas first class, heading to Lithuania. 24 hours later, I was heading back the other way, so I'm not quite. It felt like a dream, certainly. I'm a 50-year-old white guy, 20 years in corporate. I've worked in lots and lots of media companies with incredibly low levels of trust and integrity and all those kind of things that companies like that value. Marty showed earlier before. And I chose that photo for a reason, and that's because of the look on my face. And I think I know it on the look on my face there. I think I'd call it melancholic if I was being kind. But essentially, I'm surface acting here, right? I'm not actually enjoying being in Qantas first class, because that's not really me, right? Because the guy on that plane is a guy who's untidy and he's forgetful. In fact, my family here, they'll validate I'm very untidy. I'm untidy and I'm forgetful and I can't remember people's names, and I'm grumpy as hell until I've had 3 coffees before lunchtime. Most of the time I prefer to be doing this. And that's the real authentic version of me. That's me in France in 2015 cycling, right? So I'd met Marty a couple of years prior to this, and I'd done a bit of consultancy work with him. And like everybody who arrives at Cogent, I'd probably worked in lots of environments where there was low levels of trust and authenticity and transparency. I certainly never worked in a place that had transparent salaries before. Marty was telling me all this great stuff, but like everybody, I was a little bit skeptical. But I had some evidence, and the evidence was the transparent salaries. So I wondered that maybe this company could be a little bit different, and the thing that made me wonder was transparent salaries. So I'm going to come back to my story a little bit later and talk through a little bit more about some of the nuts and bolts of Cogent and about the day-to-days at Cogent. So yeah, that's you again now.
Yeah. So we just want to cover briefly the process that people go through when they join. And it's to some extent not unusual to a hiring process at lots of other corporates, but we want to articulate one particular point. So to start off with, we find people, that's largely through word of mouth in our industry, but sometimes through recruiters. Then we get to the point where when they come in for interviews, we do a couple of different interview stages. So one that's different is we do a values-based interview. We try to assess whether the values of the person that we're potentially hiring correlate with the values that we have inside Cogent. In particular, we try and call out, talk about some bad experiences that might have happened in the workplace and how did you react to those sorts of things, and get a sense of them. We, of course, do a practical interview. Everyone does one of those. And once we get through to the point where we say we want to hire someone, we do a salary assessment. Now, this is where the magic happens. This is the moment when people really kind of understand what that is. So one of those is, I've just recently described the salary model and all of those things. So the people who've interviewed the candidate will go away and say, well, we think that they have this level of skills and responsibilities impact, and they're at this level on the salary model. But what we also do is slide a copy of it over to the candidate and say, can you assess yourself, please? Tell us where you think you sit on the salary model. So they actually get the opportunity to do that work themselves, and then we talk about the differences. Now, a really happy case happens reasonably commonly, which is they assess themselves at a level and we assess them at the same level, and we say, great, we're done. Here's the salary that is paid for that level. If you're happy with that, that's fine. We're kind of done. Sometimes they will assess themselves lower than we assess them. And we say, we actually think you're a bit better than that. Let's talk about the differences. But again, there's the salary. Sometimes they will assess themselves higher. This is the case where there's a difficult conversation, where we have to say, we actually don't think you're as good as you think you are. But again, we talk about why, and we either come to an agreement or not. But the nice thing is, they immediately see the model and the salaries associated with the levels on that model. And that's a really unusual scenario when you're in an interview process for a company. And again, that sets the tone for coming in and joining Cogent. And people realise that, that we really do have transparency. And of course, then they get hired. So we're going to tell you lots more stories. But the point really here is that that process and that realisation about transparency is something that we live by is everyone's story. Everyone that joins Cogent has that story. And they've been through the process of self-assessment and seeing the story. So we're going to tell a few more now to try and give some specific examples of how it manifests in other ways. Sure.
This is Kamal. Kamal's been working with us about a year. It's a great photo of Kamal, actually. And he joined us Cogent was his first job from when he joined from moving here from Egypt. And he'd been through the process and he got to the assessment point of our process, and he was starting to realise there was something a little bit different about Cogent, about the transparency. But he had a bit of a problem, which he'd not declared to us at this point, and that his wife was quite ill and she was pregnant, and there was some risk around the baby, and he wasn't really sure how we would deal with that or how we'd want to manage that with him. It's a simple story, but because of the transparency he'd encountered through the process, he made the decision to just come to us and tell us about that, and of course our reaction was to be incredibly supportive. And it's probably fair to say now that his wife's very healthy and he's got a 9-month-old boy called Yusef, but just a really simple story about that moment of magic that occurs when people realise that you're being transparent with them, they can be transparent with you, you're effectively giving them permission to be themselves and be their authentic selves at that point. And really that transparent moment of transparency is really about empowering other values such as integrity and respect, and we'll come back to a little bit later about some more details around that. We'll be telling some more stories about working at Cogent as well. So as well as having salary transparency, we have full transparency across all our finances. And there's a little bit of a paradox around that, in that if you give everybody full transparency to the finances, they actually don't care very much. So this is me at a company meeting trying to get people interested in our finances. And I've got reindeer ears on, as you can see, nobody's paying attention. They're actually all kind of playing with the food and getting a drink, things I do. Everybody at Cogent has access to all our finances, to our budget, to our accounting system Xero, to our revenue systems, to our tracking system. But here's the thing, nobody looks at it. Why is that? Well, I'll tell another story that's sort of related to that came out as we were doing some research around this, and it's the Dutch window story. I don't know if anyone's ever lived in Holland, but most of the houses in Holland have really big windows that face onto the street, and most of those houses don't have any blinds or curtains. It's a bit of a strange thing, isn't it? But here's the thing, anybody could look inside anybody's windows, but nobody does. And we think that's the same analogy. We think actually by exposing all the information, people have a disinterest in it because they trust that we're actually handling that information and that information well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of, we have the salary table now, and actually the salary table at Cogent is in fact this enormous Google spreadsheet now that lives in the cloud, and talk a bit about how we manage that spreadsheet and how we circulate that spreadsheet. Firstly, obviously that spreadsheet lives in the cloud, and everybody at Cogent has access to that. There's nothing hidden in that. Everybody's name is in there, everybody's level is in there, and the associated salary is in there as well. So once a year we have a process to go through and kind of reassess everybody against that salary table. Now, the first thing to call out is we were reassessing against the salary table, not their salary at this point, right? That does come in later. The first thing we do is kick off the process and make sure everybody remembers where the spreadsheet is. And then we get feedback, and we go out to everybody at the company and we say, it's time to give feedback on each other. And people do that. And anybody can give feedback on anybody else, and anybody can recommend a salary change for anybody else. And the manager's job, the manager of each people, and the senior manager's job in the company is to aggregate all that feedback up. Now, at this point, that feedback is confidential. We don't share that feedback because we also have a value of personal well-being, and some of that feedback could conflict with that, so we keep that secret. Now, we leave it to the choice of people if they want to reveal that feedback. I give mine out, and a bunch of people do, but not everybody does. That's okay, it's their decision. And then the managers, also parallel with this is when we start work on the actual salaries. We go out to the market and try and understand for all the different jobs we have at Cogent, from which we maintain a salary table, we try and work out where they've moved over the last 12 months. And there's actually reasonably simple ways of doing that. Most of the big recruitment companies publish documents around that. We aggregate that up. We also pull out inflation data as well to understand. We probably rank market data over inflation data, and they can move differently. So for instance, this year, our developers' salaries only moved up a few percent, I think, but our product managers' salaries, the product managers' market salaries have moved up much higher than that, 5–10%. Then we basically take all that information and aggregate it into a draft of where we think everybody else is. So the senior managers take care of this. We get together, we debate each person, and then we reassess where they are and change their position or keep their position. Normally speaking, people only move one position, right? I would say in an average year, 30–40% of people don't move, 20–30% of people move up a level, and the rest may move up even more. And also at the same time as that, we're also publishing our draft of the salary changes as well, right? So those two processes are decoupled from each other. We're not talking to people about their salary, we're talking about where they are on the table. But here's the thing, we're not finished at that point, we're keeping going. Because probably there's around about 10% of people at this point that are probably not quite comfortable with where they are. They've probably got a stronger argument. They want to make some different arguments for their position on the table. We might at this point go in and get more feedback. We might go out to customers even that we've worked with to get feedback. We have instances where people work off-site for long times. We're not fully clear where they're at. And we aggregate that feedback up more and more and more. Now, at this point, we're probably around about 6–7 weeks into the process. All the managers are getting pretty exhausted about talking about each other. And we do occasionally get to the point with individuals where we don't agree, actually, and that's okay. Ultimately, we're going to make the decision on that. And there's probably, maybe one case a year where that happens. But often we'll agree some sort of interim plan that they may get a rise in 6 months if they develop some specific skill on the salary table. And then we publish it after 2 months, and the managers go to the pub because they're normally pretty exhausted at this point. And this is one of the things we want to talk about, that having a system like this with a structure that is as objective as possible is most of the year, we think it's easier, but for a couple of months a year, when you've got to do assessments against it, it's a lot of hard work, right? A lot of hard work, and you've got to give everybody a voice in the company. I'm going to tell a few more stories. So this is Lasan. Lasan actually has been with Cogent around about 2 years. Oh yeah, I missed it, sorry, yeah. This is Lasan, I can see him here. Lasan's from Iran. He's a very kind of cerebral, articulate, but quiet developer. He's not somebody who would probably fight his own corner. When he joined Cogent, he went through our assessment process, and he was assessed at a particular level. And actually in Lasan's story, this is a story where we got it wrong. Lasan actually went off-site to work with a customer for quite a long time, around about 6 months, so we didn't have a lot of insight into where he was. But when it came around to the assessment point, we pulled in the data, and it was very clear that we got Lasan wrong. And in fact, probably the wrongest we've ever got anybody, I think. I think in the end, we worked out he was 3 levels below where he should have been. So obviously, we immediately moved him. I'm telling you that story because we got it wrong, and we possibly had a bunch of unconscious bias that made us get that wrong, but because of the transparency and the public nature of our system, it was corrected, right? So it took a while, but it got corrected. That's an unusually long time for a misassessment like that to getting corrected. Got another story here that Marty's going to tell.
Yeah, so this is Kath. And we got some feedback from Kath about her interview process, and she says, as she went through that whole salary assessment process, these are her words: "As a typical female, I didn't blow too much smoke up my own butt." So it turned out that, and I remember I was part of this process, so I came in at the end to do the salary conversation. And I'll call out here, the Kath was hired as a designer, I'm an engineer. We don't understand each other's worlds very well, but we had designers go through the process and do some assessments. And we hired Kath at a particular level, and she accepted the level that we had offered her. And after about 3 or 4 months, her co-workers, the other designers at Cogent, who had been involved in the salary assessment process and knew her level, came to us and said, "Kath's at the wrong level. We got it wrong. She should be higher. She needs to be paid at a higher level. She's performing at higher than where she are." So I got the chance to go and speak to her, and I pulled her into a room, and I didn't know this at the time, but I said to her, "Kath, I need to have a talk to you. Sometimes we get the pay assessments wrong, and we did with you." And apparently, I found out now, she panicked thinking she was about to get a pay cut. And my next words were, "We think you should be at a higher level and get a salary increase." So, and that was not a thing that Kath asked for. This was her peers who realised that she was at the wrong level. And that's a situation that could not have occurred had we not been transparent, right? That would have just slid under the radar forever. Because certainly we didn't know, we are not designers. Her peers needed to have that information and data to be able to tell us and let us know that, right? Yeah.
I'm going to tell a couple of quick stories about working with Cogent, because as well as internally we operate transparency, we encourage it externally with partners and customers as well. Tell a quick story about Jimmy. So this Jimmy is our recruiter. He's been with us about 6 months. About 3 months in, he had a candidate represented to him from another recruiter, and it's somebody we'd actually seen before, and we knew what we were being told was not true about this particular person, right? And there was a bunch of politics involved in this. Jimmy knew people, and some of our people knew their people, and Jimmy didn't know what to do. He was getting a little bit out of control, and he came to see me, and he said, what should I do? How do I handle this? I said, well, it's a tricky situation, but in tricky situations, what we do is we go back to our values, right? So you should go tell that recruiter that we know this person and just lay it all out on the table. So we did do that. And it's an interesting thing that we do externally, because we give, by being transparent with our customers and partners, we give them the permission to be transparent with us and to be a more authentic version of themselves with us. And in this scenario, the guy who represented this candidate to us sort of confessed that he got it all wrong and that he was under huge pressure to deliver sales, and now he's one of our best recruiters because we've got a really, really strong working relation with it. Just a simple story about we externally take our values out to the world as well. And I'm going to tell you a story now about leaving as well, because as I said before, people do leave Cogent. So obviously we're a small company, we're about 50 people. There are career paths. There are an infinite possible number of career paths for people, and we can't fulfill all of those, so people do leave. And actually, as I was writing this slide last night, it's quite funny, because we also do really encourage people to, because we're entrepreneurs, we encourage people to also be entrepreneurs themselves. And actually, as I was writing this slide last night, about 8 of my people were in the next room to me having pizzas, talking about their new businesses and their eventual flight from Cogent. I thought that was kind of ironic as I was writing this slide. But this is a story about Nicholas, and Nicholas doesn't work at Cogent anymore. It's a great photo of Nicholas. He works at a company that's one of our customers called Huru. Nicholas had been at Huru as a consultant working for us, and that's always a very delicate subject when you're a consultancy moving to one of our customers. It's a bit of a no-no in consulting world. But Stu, there was a bunch of things he wanted from his job and that we couldn't give him, and he knew Huru had, but he knew it was going to be a really difficult conversation. But because he values transparency and he'd been at Cogent 2-3 years, he decided just to be really transparent about it. So he came to me and told me the story, and my first reaction was to say thank you. And I knew this was going to be really difficult, because I knew I probably couldn't stop him going. I didn't want to stop him going, but I also knew I was probably going to lose out if I was really transparent on this. So I do what I do at Cogent is I called the customer, a guy called Stu, and I said, Nicholas wants to come and work for you. The three of us sat down, we had a conversation about it, really transparent, and we agreed that Nicholas would go and work at Huru. And I'll call out about that, as Marty said, that we were really transparent about that. Doesn't always mean you're going to get good outcomes. It was a difficult conversation, but actually Cogent got the worst outcomes out of that because we lost a really valuable consultant. But Nicholas was rewarded for his transparency because part of our profit share policy is it's only paid out on a particular day of the year, and you have to be an employee on that day of the year. And Nicholas was going to walk before that. So I said to Nicholas, you should stay another 6 weeks and get your profit share. And he did that year. That was just a few months ago. And he got a $12,500 profit share bonus because he was transparent. And we still have great relationships. And he gave me permission to put his picture up here. So we're going to move into now a bunch of consequences of salary transparency, how we see them. And the first thing we always get asked is, does it work? Obviously, we're believers on that, and you could say we're being a little bit subjective, but there is objective data. At Cogent, we use a system called Culture Amp, and that's used for measuring engagement of your staff. And we run the survey there about once every 6 months. And you'll see up there on the left-hand side, like that's our top-level engagement number. And on the top right of that, you'll see there's a comparison. Culture Amp run a benchmark, a global benchmark of the tech companies, and there's some really big tech companies in this benchmark, like Adobe and Airbnb. And we aspire to be in the top 10%, have the top 10% of the most engaged staff, and you can see in the top left there, we're just in the top 10%, we're actually 2% above the top 10%. That probably puts us in the top 8% of companies globally for staff engagement. So I think that's a little bit of evidence. We work on some more as well. There's a system out there called Glassdoor where people can go and put anonymous feedback about companies on there. And you can see there we score 5 out of 5 there, and we're particularly proud of the fact that we score 5 out of 5 for our values and for work-life balance. That's something we really care about. So a bit of objective data as well. And kind of drilling down a little bit into the Culture Amp survey, there's a question specifically about salaries there, and you can read what it says, but it's really about, am I being paid fairly relative to similar roles in other companies? And here's the good news, we do really well on that. You'll see on there that we score 83%. Now, that might not mean much, but of course we have a benchmark to work with there, and you'll see that we score a whopping 14% above the Culture Amp global benchmark for this question. And that probably puts us in the top 1% of companies globally where people think they're paid a fair salary. Now, I'll call out that there's, I think, 8% there. There's a bunch of people who don't, and that's okay. Maybe they're up for reassessment, maybe we got them wrong, but I'm very, very confident that our system will work that out at some point, and it'll do that in a transparent way. So we're just going to kind of summarize a little bit now on the consequences, both positive and negative, and tell a few more stories towards the end.
Here's the first one, and we've said this a couple of times. That model that we build behind our transparent salaries is hard work. It took me a couple of years to get the first version of it done. It's had 3 major revisions over a decade, and they took a lot of work, and we still do incremental updates every year. And Mark talked about that 2-month period of salary reviews. That is hard work. We have to put a lot of effort into that. We think it's worthwhile. Yeah.
Another negative is sometimes we miss out on good people, right? Because we can't pay people more than what our salary model says we should pay them, right? And we've got a good example of that recently where we had a really talented developer who actually was a female, and actually talented developers that are women are quite rare at the moment unfortunately in our industry. She was in the process, she'd been offered by a competitor quite a lot more money than us, and it transpired that that competitor had actually made a very deliberate decision to pay women more to try and address the balance. And as a company, we got together, I got 20 of the leading people of the company together, and we talked about that as whether or not, do we want to break our model for this reason? And after a reasonably robust debate, we came to a fairly strong agreement that we were not going to break our model for that. That meant we lost out on somebody who was really talented. It happens. I'd still say it's also true for all businesses that they lose out on talent, but at least we know why we lost out.
Sometimes we pay people too much or too little, and maybe I'll paraphrase this and say, sometimes we pay people more than they would have otherwise accepted the job for because of the transparency, right? So, and that's okay, and sometimes we do actually misassess them too high, but I'll cover the scenario separately. So if we've assessed someone at a level and we've given them a salary that we realise some months later was too much, we don't do anything. We just leave them at that level. It's our mistake. We've made a contractual commitment to that person about their salary. We just leave them at their level and wait for the salary model to catch up, because over the years the salaries increase just through CPI and market increases. And once it catches up, it's kind of normalised. And if people know that, it hasn't happened very often, but it has happened a few times over a decade. And that's our reaction to that. If we pay too little, that's an easier scenario. We've actually told a couple of stories where we realise we pay someone too little, we go to them, we tell them, we fix it. So pretty straightforward.
There's another negative, and that's there's a potential conflict with our other value of diversity, right? So, and I'll play this out that not all cultures are transparent as our cultures are. Cultures that have high levels of corruption tend to have low levels of transparency. We hire a lot of new immigrants in Australia. We've definitely had scenarios where transparency has been a real problem for people within our system and they don't like it. So we lose out on people sometimes because of transparency, and we therefore lose out on some potential diversity in the business, which is something we also value. We have to balance those two things.
When times are tough, everybody knows. So our transparency is not just about salaries, it's about all of the company's financial position. We talk about that openly at a company meeting every month. So if we go through a tough period, and this has happened several times over the years, we're up there month after month saying we've made a loss, the money in the bank's starting to go down, we're running low. And that can create anxiety that the staff would otherwise not have felt if we were just hiding all of that information. So we have to go through a process of giving people enough context and information to understand not just the position, but what we're doing about it to ensure that the company can get through and move on.
Positive consequences, and this is where we're on a good ground here. So pay disparity at Cogent is almost impossible. And we've given a bunch of examples about that earlier, but we fully acknowledge that bias occurs, conscious and unconscious, gender, race, religion, sexuality, introvert, extrovert, good negotiator, bad negotiator. Things happen, our system fixes it. And we're really confident that disparity is almost impossible over a reasonably small time frame at Cogent.
This is one of the biggest positive benefits for us. We become known for transparency early because it's really unusual. It's one of the reasons we're here today. People get to know us because of transparent salaries, and that's a differentiator when people are looking for somewhere to work. So we get to hire good people because they like that. They come and seek us out.
Flip side, when times are good, everybody knows about it, right? So it's the flip side of the negative as well, right? So obviously times are a little bit easier, times are quite good at the moment. It's a happy time.
Yeah. It takes the salary table off the issue so we can get on with other stuff. So we shift away from dollars. We talk mostly about the model. People assess against that and they understand how things work. And once staff get used to that, which is really past the first review cycle, it's really simple and really common, and the staff population understand how it works and they feel comfortable with it. So it means we don't get distracted by assessing salaries. It's quite straightforward for us.
Yeah, I think we think that we have more productive, engaged staff who want to get on with their job. So this is the kind of final slide, I think, on this positives, and I think this is the thing that both Marty and I feel is the most important things, right, is that, and we've touched on this a few times, is that transparent salaries are strong evidence that we live by our values, and very importantly, it's strong external evidence that we live by our values. It's very hard if you're entering a company to say you can put your values up and say these are our values, but as somebody who's not in the company, you have no idea if they live by them. This is a super strong signal. And it sets the tone for culture at Cogent and creates space for a number of secondary order values, right? So we talked before about all the big companies looking for respect and integrity and so on. We don't think you can truly have those things unless you have transparency. And that's why transparency and financial transparency are incredibly important things. They create space for a bunch of secondary values, very human values, and we think of those. And this actually, I've got the 4 of them here: trust, integrity, safety, and authenticity. And they're not my takes. I actually went out to all our staff and asked them what they think about transparency. What does it mean to them? And this is really aggregated statement of theirs. Now, we're going to read a few stories out about those, but we're running a little bit over time, so I'll keep going to kind of one story here that one person in that little survey I did just before this lecture, Adam Murray, gave me this wonderful statement about what transparency means to him, and I'll let you just read that before we finish. And finally, I'll just come back to the kind of 50-year-old balding white guy who can't remember people's names and how he's feeling about all this. And that's him, like a pig in shit, giving a presentation to staff on 101 of bike maintenance. My jobs, like all CEOs' jobs, are quite hard. I have really tough days. I have to make some really tough decisions. But I have a framework for doing that in, and in many ways, as Marty said, my job is really, really easy, because if I've got a tough decision to make, I fall back to the values and the values of transparency. And transparent salaries is really, that creates that transparency in salaries is really the thing that creates those cultural attributes that makes Cogent such an amazing place to work. So transparency is great for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marty and Mark, for sharing your experience of pay transparency and how it has impacted on the ability of your organisation to attract, motivate and retain employees. I would now like to invite questions, if you have any, and can I just ask, for the purposes of the recording, that you wait for a roving mic.
Thank you very much. Everything in life and nature, I believe, falls on the bell curve, including employees' performance. So in my view, there are employees who perform almost 10 times or even 100 times better than lowest performing employee. And I believe they deserve to be paid as such. And if you make it transparent, there's going to be animosity in our egalitarian, obsessed society. There's going to be animosity and resentment. So your comment on that, please. Thank you.
Sure. What you're suggesting there is that you can't define why that person is more effective or more productive than the next person, and I think you can. And so that is effectively, there'll be an attribute there, or a bunch of attributes that can be defined and captured in the salary table. And we're actually talking about a very good example of that just before we came on stage. And I talked a lot about this idea. We needed a couple more people with gravitas. And it was a bit of a running joke in the company that I kept on talking about gravitas, but nobody really knew what it meant. Well, we defined it in the end. Actually, we defined it in terms of a range of competencies, and we're very clear now what that means. And you've got more of those things in these competencies, you operate on a higher level in the salary table. So I just say that in the end, you can define those things. You've just got to do the work.
I'll just add that whilst there might be some people who can perform at 10 times a level of someone else, we won't hire that person. We won't pay someone 10 times more than someone else. I think I showed the kind of range. It's about 5 or 6 times from the bottom to the top. And I don't think the market will. And if that person can get 10 times higher salary somewhere in the market, good luck to them. I'm happy to accept that that's a consequence of our model.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm an industrial relations practitioner and workplace lawyer, and throughout my professional career I've been involved in a fair share of what we would call classification disputes relating to traditional classification issues. And I would be very much interested when you talked about how you determine the wages initially in respect of skills, responsibility, and impact. How do you actually measure at initial level the impact, and what do you mean by that? And does the measurement of impact is the same across everybody's?
Yeah, so impact is defined really about what's the group of people that you influence. So we have right at the bottom level of the salary table someone who's a hire straight out of university. We don't expect them to impact anyone other than themselves. And then right at the top of the salary level, Mark's the CEO, Mark needs to influence the industry, all of our customer base and the community around us, as well as the entire company. And somewhere in between, you might have someone who's a team lead who's expected to influence the 4 or 5 people that they're in. So that's kind of how the definition works. The way that we assess that is we try and talk about the radiuses of impact and talk to people about their experiences, so that the initial assessment when they've just joined the company is we say, tell us about your working history, and we try to explore examples of that. So, one of the side effects is our goal is to try and shift towards objectivity, but it's not completely objective. There's certainly subjective elements at it. So we have to make educated guesses on those things, especially at higher levels. It's a bit difficult to do those things. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just wonder whether when you say impact in terms of economics or
no, we do it by example. So influence. So for example, we're a software engineering company. We'll have a team of software engineers working on a problem. Have you actually gone up to the whiteboard and drawn a design for how we might build part of the system and convince people that that's relevant? So we do those sorts of things. Yeah.
Do you think a model like this would have scalability issues for a larger organisation than yours?
It's a good question. We get asked this a lot. And I'll say it like this. Like, we started out wondering if we could do it with 10 people, and then we got to 20, and then we got to 30. Now we're up at about 50. I can see a clear line of sight to this would work with 100, and that'd be fine. The thing that I have in my head is Dunbar's number, if you're familiar with that, which is mathematically 150, but tends to in practice be at kind of about 100. It's the number of people that you can know and work with at a reasonable level before it just becomes a name on a piece of paper and you can't know, right?
I'd like to try.
We would like to try. I'd love for a big organisation to give it a go.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think you would do it by department, something like that, and do it where it's easiest, and then work out from there. You wouldn't do it all in one go.
Thank you. I thought it was a terrific presentation and a great example for all of us. I'm interested in creativity and innovation. I mean, often when we think about salary setting, we think about influence and we think about responsibility. We might think about financial impact, or we might think about problem solving and the degree of challenge, but which almost by its nature comes from a reactive mindset rather than a creative mindset. How do you capture creativity or innovation in your system?
You want to try?
Try and come up with a creative answer. I'll address creativity and innovation separately. So, with difficulty, I'll say straight off the bat, like none of those things are easy. We also have creativity as a value, right? So, or did for some time. And most of that manifests itself in the designer role that we have at Cogent. I'll say most of the engineers that we have are quite hyper-rational people. I personally identify as that. And it manifests itself in some of the definitions in the designer role, but I'll also call out that we've made explicit efforts to push it out, because we don't want to have just the designers being creative and not the engineers. We want those things to kind of filter across those things. So it comes out in descriptions and examples in skills and responsibilities and impact, but it's really difficult. The other side, innovation, comes out a bit of a different way. So we actually encourage innovation and encourage people, as Mark mentioned, to even begin their own side businesses, because that's kind of what we do day to day, is work with startups. So one of the ways that we can do that is we will encourage people to start a business and actually back them and invest in them a little bit. So they can end up actually being rewarded by owning part of a thing rather than being rewarded on a salary table, which is a topic for another day. Lots of detail on that too.
One final question at the back.
Hi there, I was just wondering, in terms of the salary package, where that comes into play when it's time to let someone go from the company, if their values no longer align. Is it a case of they sort of drop from level to level to level to level to they're obsolete and they're sort of done, or how does that work when it comes to firing someone? Does the salary package come into that, or how do you keep that objective?
Yeah, like it doesn't come into it. If somebody is if somebody needs to leave the company, it's probably for reasons that are not related to their salary, certainly not. It'd be related to culture or values, probably, and we probably would there'd be no attempt to ratchet salary or change salary or anything like that. It would be expressed as a conversation about why you're not the right fit for the business, rather than a kind of punitive kind of salary attack or something like that.
I've got one example over a decade, and probably 100 people or more, where we dropped a salary level, and that was when someone explicitly wanted to stop coming into the city and wanted to be able to work from home, and we talked about it and acknowledged that he simply couldn't have the same impact because he was one of the leaders that would go out on site to customers and try and influence and work with them side by side, and just acknowledged that he couldn't do that anymore, so agreed to drop him one level. But that was a conversation that we had together.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your questions. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Marty and Mark. Your approach to pay disclosure at Cogent challenges the norms in many Australian organisations. We appreciate the open and honest way in which you have described your experiences, both positive and negative, with pay transparency. You have added considerably to the overall level of understanding of this often controversial topic. Marty and Mark, here's a small token of appreciation from the faculty.
Thank you very much.
Great. Please join me in thanking Marty and Mark for their presentation.